All right, we'll go ahead and get started on Chapter 6 lecture, which is how to work with controllers and routing. But, you are working, really you're working with routing. You just happen to work with routing in controllers. Now, what is routing? I mean, we've worked with routing in the JavaScript class, and so you might remember there are back-end routes and there are front-end routes. And ultimately, when you hit a route provides access to a resource. And so on a front-end route, you're typically asking for like an HTML file that lets you view that HTML file in a browser. And so there's front-end route, and then there's back-end routes. Back-end routes typically provide access to resources like databases for orders, databases for credentials, usernames, and passwords. And so when we're talking about routing, we're talking about the URL that's built, right, to either request a front-end resource or a back-end resource. Of course, most of what we're going to talk about today is working with back-end resources, because the front-end will be when we really start hitting views and when we start working with what are called razor views. And so again, what are we talking about? We're talking about routing. Routing is, what are the URLs? What are the paths to provide access to resources? Specifically, more of these back-end resources when we're working with routing in the controllers, as opposed to the views, which represent our front-end routes. And so I like this chapter because it talks about not only how to do routing in .NET Core MVC, but also what are some best practices, like what are good practices for routings. And so, as web development students, I feel that it's best to learn, what are the best practices for URLs. We learn HTML, we learn C#, we learn all these coding languages, but really what are the best practices for not only for developers, what are good routes for developers? What are good routes for end users? Like they're our main customers. So not only what are good routes for us to code, but what are good routes for the end users to work with? But then also, what are good routes that make our sites accessible? When we say, anytime you hear the word accessibility, you're talking about making our websites usable for users with disabilities, right? So not, making our routes accessible for everybody, but also for users with disabilities, and accessible for search engines, right? Because search engines absolutely look at your URLs to be able to optimize your page to make it, indexable on Google and make it found on Google. And so there's a lot to this chapter that weighs on those areas. There's a lot to routing that matters for developers, that matters for SEO, for making your websites accessible on Google, for making your websites accessible for users with disabilities, and just making them accessible for everybody, regardless of any sort of disability. So there's a lot to this chapter that will help in all those areas. And so, of course, we're learning this in .NET Core MVC. So, I am going to be doing some coding so that it's just not me talking the whole time. And you can begin to understand. If you want to follow along, you can follow along, or you can just watch. It doesn't really make a big difference at this point. There's no grade or anything associated with this. And so I'm just going to, spin up a lecture repo, routing demo, and then I'll just call this project 1 for my project name. And I'm going to uncheck HTTPS because even though I can get that working, it throws errors in the beginning that required fixing, and now I don't have to fix those errors. So, kind of boot this up. And as that's booting up, we'll open up Program CS. And so there's really, when it comes to routing, you have to understand how does it work out of the box. And so because we've been now exposed to this for about a month now, we've been learning .NET Core for about a month, you should have at this point a pretty good idea of how routing works out of the box, I should say, and what is the default pattern. And you can kind of see here the default pattern says, hey, as part of your URL, the first part is a controller. The second part is an action. And when I'm saying parts, these are called segments, right? Every segment is separated by a slash, right? So there's a new term, these routing segments. The first segment is the controller. The second segment is the action. The third segment is the ID. Now I'm going to draw your attention to these curly braces. Okay, so what these curly braces represent is that these sections can be dynamic. These are not static. Okay, so for example, this could be the home controller or it could be the product controller. It's dynamic. It is not a static thing every single time. Okay, so I just want to point that out. That's something new, that those curly braces represent the ability for that segment to be dynamic as opposed to static. If I were to code it like this without the curly braces, then now to follow this pattern, I would have to statically configure the home route. Or of course I should probably do that lowercase h. Okay, so that's something new, that understanding what goes in these curlies is just a difference between static and dynamic. No. If you don't have that, it would just be, you wouldn't need the word controller, no. And then there's also a difference, of course, between this question mark. So what does the question mark do? Well, that's optional, right? So the curlies represent static versus dynamic, and I will do a static route example so that you can see that. And then the third option there, when you have the question mark inside of the curly, represents that this is an optional segment. You do not have to, whereas these two are not optional. Okay, so as we load this page, by default, you're getting the /home/index. Okay, because these are the defaults. They are implied at localhost at whatever port you're at. Okay, so realize /home/index is this method. Now, what is the third parameter? Well, we're not really using that right now. And so, of course, if I go to my home controller and we kind of take a look at what's in here, boilerplate, there's a lot of stuff that you frankly don't need, and you can delete this. We'll keep the privacy in there. We could take out the error. And so what's happening here, I'm always going to do this. I'm going to click this and rebuild and always do that. We're basically hitting this index method when the home page loads. It returns us to a view that is named index inside of our views folder home. So views, home, index. So when this home controller returns to the view, this is kind of the default behavior. Of course, it loads up this view, and this is what we're sitting here looking at. And as you guys know, we can change this and what have you, and there you go. Okay, that's not the point of this lecture. So one thing that we can do here is we have a whole chapter on views and how to customize Razor views and work with Razor views. But right now we're just focusing on routing. and more the back end. These are back end routes as opposed to front end routes. And we can return a view, but keep in mind what this action method is doing. It's returning a data type of iActionResult that is an interface. Okay, therefore any class or any data type that implements that interface can be a valid return type out of this method. Okay, so there is, and I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let me come back to this. Out of the box, there's 3 methods that get the default routing to work. And so for default routing to work, there's 3 parts. And line 4 is kind of the first part. Line 15 is the second part, use routing. And line 19 is the last part. So inside of program.cs, these are the 3 parts, the 3 method calls, call them middleware, that come together to get that default routing to work. I would probably say, if you're looking in the book, if you're looking at page 205, there is a definition of what each one of these methods do, right? So you could see the add controllers with views. It says it adds the services necessary to support an MVC app. Okay. Adds the services necessary to support an MVC app. That description to me isn't very meaningful. I don't glean a lot from that description. So like my brain says, well, this is just boilerplate required, for routing to work. If you look at use routing, selects the endpoint for the route if one is found, right? So selects the endpoint for the route if one is found. Now, I will say that in general, and I'll actually add the definition here, even though adds the services necessary to support an MVC app. In general, after ASP.NET Core 3.0, we use endpoint routing, which is a new feature. Okay, so endpoint routing is something that they talk about a lot. All endpoint routing is that when you have a route, it leads you basically to a method, right? It leads you to an endpoint. That endpoint is a method. And so that's considered a best practice. Of course, that's what we looked at when we're sitting here and we're saying, hey, this route takes us to this endpoint. So this index action method is an endpoint, and that's what we're using here. It's just a term, again, a couple new terms in this chapter, endpoint routing being one of those terms. All that means, your routes bring you to a method, and that's the code that you will execute. If I plop open, I don't even know where my PowerPoint went. Did I close my PowerPoint? I guess I did. No, there it is. So you kind of go over program.cs and these different methods. There is another method that you could use. Use routing, and then map controller route is the third one that's down here. Okay, so talk about the default routes and the default conventions. We talk about dynamic versus static, and optional versus required. These are all different things here, which kind of leads us to all these different segments that kind of how this works out of the box. If you go to localhost, it takes you here. If you go to localhost/product, it'll load the index action by default. Again, that's just part of the default. Product list will take you to the product list method. Product/list/guitars. We'll put guitars for the ID. Now, I will draw your attention to this. Product/list/guitars. Notice that the ID is guitars. If you're sitting here thinking ID, normally we think of IDs as numeric values. Okay, but in this sense, the ID, well, where's it coming from? It's coming from the URL. The URL is a string, right? So even though the identifier is ID, this is really being used, this could be used, this ID, as a string. So if you look at the data type, obviously you're going to have to store this ID as a string, and it would filter, right? So in JavaScript, of course, we had paging controls. Everyone shake your head. You remember paging and filtering? Yes, a little bit in JavaScript. This is what we're doing here. We're filtering our products by using the ID of a string of guitars, okay, and passing that in. So just want to point that out, that an ID could, of course, be a number, and then you would get the ID by its primary key out of the database, or in some cases, you could use that a little differently. Okay, and again, this is just all out of the box. And what you could do to kind of jump out of this example a little bit, instead of returning view, because we kind of want to isolate our routes and only work with, instead of working with views, we just want to kind of, hello from home controller index action. Okay, instead of returning a view, you could just return essentially a data type of content, and content is just returning a string. Now, I want to remind you what this reminds me of, right? In the early days of Express, right? Remember our Express routes? We had the request object and the response object, and we would say res.send, and res.send text, basically sending from your back end, you would just send some text to the front end, and it didn't matter. We didn't have a front end, right? In the early days of JavaScript, we would just do res.send, and we'd send a little bit of text. That's all we're doing here. Our back end routes are now just going to send a little bit of text, and if I were to kind of do this, now we just kind of removed that view. We're not going to a view. We're just sending some text from our back end to our front end, whatever that front end may be. So notice, even though I'm putting in that /3, it is still landing on the home index because I don't have another method written that can accept that value. So let's go ahead and write a public iActionResult index that takes an int ID, or better yet, because we saw that it could be a string, and return content, and we'll do a little placeholder, and hello from home controller index action ID of ID, and hit a semicolon, right? So now there should be a difference between these two routes, and I should return different content. Of course, the request matched multiple endpoints, and so this is something, when I've done this in the past, I always have this. I've had this problem in the past as well. Let me see if I change that to an int. I don't know that that matters. So if I take that 3 off, all right, I'm going to delete this one because what it's having a hard time doing, even though I'm not understanding why, it's having a hard time with my route saying, well, do I go to this method or do I go to this method? Clearly, if I provide the int, I would expect it to go to this one. If I don't provide the int, I would expect it to go to this one. So let me just delete this one and go back. Home/index/3. And okay, this is interesting. Okay, so once I just did a build, this is working. Okay, so I just had to rebuild my code and kind of get it to its current state, where here we have one method, one index method, and if I don't provide an ID, it's going to say ID of 0. But if I go /home/index/4, we get an ID of 4. Let's see if I leave that blank, index of 0. And if I were to bring it back, public iAction result index, yeah, it starts breaking. So instead of, I understand what it's telling me, which is multiple endpoints are matching. And so let's just delete the one that's not being used. And then, you know, really you could just get by with this one, and then you could have a simple if statement. If the ID is 0, you could do one thing. If the ID is anything else, you could do something else, right? So let's do this now. So that's fine. We know how to handle that. And then we could return content. Hello from home controller, privacy action. Of course, if I spin this up now, /home/privacy. Okay. So pretty straightforward. The kind of the weird thing is I would expect that index method that it could be overloaded. That's what I was trying to do. I was trying to overload that method, and it was the application was having a hard time deciphering when you're using an overloaded method, which one should it use? Yes. Yeah, so when you return content, you're just sending a string from your back end to your front end. When you return to a view, you're going to send it into this views folder home index, and you're returning HTML that's going to be read. Yeah. And so, you know, this you could, you know, when you return to a view, you can do a whole lot more by returning to a view. But since we're just returning content, it's just kind of a string from our back end. Yes, sir.
I figured out how to make it to where you can use index.
What did you do for that?
HTTP gets. Okay, so there's make an index for that one first.
Yeah. So so you're saying HTTP get here?
For that one, HTTP get.
Yeah.
And then for the other one, HTTP get.
Yeah.
And then next to that one, add some parentheses. Quotation marks. So curly braces. And ID.
Hey. Good solution. Let's spin that up now, and that solves our overloaded ambiguous problem. Let's go home index, and that's index action /5. Let me rebuild. Build, and launch. /home/index/4. It's compiling, but not landing. Does yours land? Do I have this right? Let's look. And so what I was doing a little bit differently, the tray, kind of see, he actually just put /5 here, then that works. Okay, and that's interesting, this /5 here, because that's actually customizing your route. Notice we don't have to go that default route anymore. So we're going to learn to customize our routes here. So that's what Trey's solution was, to add kind of a custom route that, again, we'll dive into that a little bit deeper. Okay, so yeah, returning content from our different action methods. I'm going to go ahead and spin up another controller for more demonstrations. And so this is going to be a product controller. So right click on controllers, add a controller. Product controller. And let's say we want to list our products. Okay, again, let's kind of, here's our endpoint. It's /product/list. If you provide a string, then it will, that string is kind of the filter, right? So the default string is to show me all products. However, if the URL says /products or /product/list/toys, well, then toys would be the filter on your products, right? So then here we can return content. And then we'll say product controller list action ID of ID. Go ahead and save that and spin that up, and /product/list/toys. So product controller list action, and then toys would be the filter. Of course, it's any string you provide, 1, 2, 3. And if you don't provide an ID, the default is show me all of the products, aka no filter. Okay, so again, we will do paging, we will do filtering in this world as well. And so this is kind of setting up your routes to do that, right? Just like we did in the JavaScript world, we had to set up our backend routes to enable paging and filtering before we did it, actually implemented it in the front end. So then another method here would be a detail public iAction. So public iAction results detail singular int ID. So if we want to get a single product by its ID, we could get, instead of hitting a list route, we go to a detail route, and that enables us to /product/ what was it? /product/detail /4. And if I leave that off, ID of 0, because integers, when they're initialized by default, have a default assignment of 0. And so if you provide an ID, of course it will use it. Otherwise, it defaults to 0. And you would say, you know, whatever you want to say, product not found. All right, so again, that's just a little bit more of working with how this works out of the box. Of course, you can create custom routes, and there are benefits to creating custom routes. These URLs, like if I go back here, /product/list, well, maybe this could be simplified, instead of 2 segments, maybe we could call the list route, we could call it, whatever.com/products, right? If you were just thinking of not a product list, but if I'm just looking at the URL, how could I improve this URL? Well, shorter URLs in general are better. You want them to be short and descriptive. So product list is kind of the same of /products, right? So yeah, this is how it works out of the box, but maybe it could be shortened to something better. Okay? So that's what we're going to learn to do in how to customize these routes. So let's kind of start by going back into program.cs. And if I scroll down here, I'm going to add another pattern. This is called a pattern for our routing. And so I'm going to add another pattern besides the default. Okay, so I'm going to add this pattern, which is app, and it's the same map controller route. Okay, which by the way, there's an easy mistake. If you look at map area controller route, we are going to talk about areas at the end of today. So don't map an area controller route. I'll talk about what that is, but this is just map controller route. And we're going to give it a name, which is paging, and a pattern of controller. The default controller is home. Action equals index, default action of index. ID, again, ID can be dynamic. /page, and then in curly's a variable called num. So, do I need a paging needs to be in quotes. And we need a semicolon. Okay. So we have now added a custom route. Regardless of the name, we're calling this the route for paging. And dynamic controller, a dynamic action, dynamic ID, a static value of page, and here is a, page 2, page 3, page 4, right? So let's look at this, right? The default route has 0 required segments, right? Because they're all in curlies. What I'm getting at is that the order of these will matter top to bottom. And so in general, the rules, you have to go from top to bottom. Your routes must be configured from most specific to least specific, right? So because this one has 1 required segment, it's more specific than the one that has 0 required segments. So this one, to hit this one, there's basically, to get here, there's 4 segments, and Well, at the end of the day, there's 0 required, but if you're going to get there, to get to the end, there's 0 required, but at the end of the day, there are 4 segments. Or excuse me, 3 segments. So we got 4 segments, 3 segments, right? And so you need to put this one on top because to hit this full route, there's 4, which is more, general than the, or more specific than the bottom one. Okay, easy for me to say. All right, and let's add one more. So here, app.map controller route, map controller route. Name of paging and sorting, and the pattern controller is home, Curly's action is index, ID in Curly's, page followed by its num, and sort by All right, so let me kind of put that all on the screen. And this one has 5 required segments, so that's why it's up at the top, right? Most specific, you got to have 5 segments to get here versus 4 versus 3. All right, so let's see if we can't hit one of these endpoints. Okay, let's hit one of these endpoints. So let's go back to our product controller. So I need a method public iActionResult list, and it needs to take in an ID, a num, and a sort by. So I'm going to take in 3 parameters: string ID, string num, string sort by. And then I'm just going to spit that back out. So now if I hit my list, okay, and we have to follow this pattern, so it needs to be page 2 sort hyphen by, and so to hit this I got to follow this pattern. All right, so let's spin that up. /product /list. Let's see if I can get there. /product /list. The ID of 1. The page. So this is page 2. Page 2 hyphen sort hyphen by sort by, and we'll say last name. And again, ambiguous match exception, so I'm going to take out my other list because I would use this one instead. So let's take out my other list, rebuild. and build, and launch. /product/list ID of 5, page 3, sort by last name. There it goes. We hit our endpoint. And so, yeah, custom routing. And that's going to enable us to eventually do paging and sorting when we start building our URLs like such. So yeah, you have to make your pattern. Of course, you have to make your pattern, and then you have to set up your URLs to hit that pattern. Now, Connor, you had a question. I don't know if I answered it in there. Yeah, so do you notice how ID, num, and sort by are matching my identifiers ID, num, and sort by? That is a hard requirement, right? You are setting up variables that their identifiers have to match. So if you don't call this ID, num, and sort by, you could guess it's not going to work, and you would guess correctly.
So you do need more than, if for some reason, if a page might only show up like just the ID, you would need a controller around that will read just the ID, right? Otherwise, it would break out.
Yeah, that's correct. Okay. So we're going to continue with this, but now, again, we learned a little bit more about how this is working out of the box and how to begin customize it. We have more to learn when it comes to customizing it, but kind of the first step in customizing it is making your pattern. And then the second step is to, make your endpoint that matches the pattern. And then you got to build the URLs that start hitting those endpoints. Okay? So there's some fair amount that's new here, but we'll go ahead and, yeah, Tony.
Could you show the URL you typed?
Yeah, the URL I typed was right here. All right, let's go ahead and take a break. Okay, so this is all working. Now, what I've had a hard time already doing today that I'm going to push that boundary and see if I'm going to continue to have it is what happens when I have an endpoint that's my product controller list now with an ID and a page num without a sort by. And so maybe this will work. So let's public action result list string ID string num. And let's just return list action ID and num. Okay, so now I need an ID first and then my num. ID first and then my num. So I should be able to leave that off. And let me boot that up because I don't think it was booted. /product/list/ID. So yeah, so this is where home controller index ID page 3. I'm not gonna harp on this now. Yeah. No, I am passing it. Product list ID 3 page 3. Now if I do hyphen sort by last name, yeah, I was getting this multiple endpoints again. So maybe instead of calling it list, you could call it anything else, and call it you can call your endpoint something different. So you're not basically, I'm trying to work with overloaded methods, and that's where the conflict is coming in. But one way of resolving it would just be call that action something else. That should allow me to hit it. /product /list2 /3 wait a minute, list2 I think I found my mistake. Instead of making two different methods to list and list2, you can start assigning default values. This is where we're going to say, okay, there's a default that can be assumed here, and that's my mistake. So the default of the ID is all. Sort by is the default price. By giving these some, we'll change this to an int num of 1. Okay, that way we can have one route, and then it'll assume some defaults if we don't provide the other segments. I think that's going to be my fix here. Product /list /3. You can see it assumes the default. /page2 sort by. Okay. So there, that route is working. The only one that's currently broke is /page2. And so let's go back to my program CS. That should be hitting that one. No. Okay, I'm going to circle back on this error so that we can move on. I'm getting this route to hit, and I can get this route to hit, but for whatever reason, I'm not getting this route to hit. And I just sat down for 15 minutes troubleshooting one person's problem, and I just had to retype it. And so there's a good chance if I retype this, it'll work, but I'm just not seeing it right now. What do you see?
Missing R.
I'm missing an R?
Controller.
That's why having many eyes on your code helps. I make the same mistakes you guys do. Controller. Thank you, Jack. I was ready to give up. I was so ready to give up. Hey! Oh, this coding stuff. Thank you, Jack. Good eyeball. Next up, changing routing. When we create these patterns for all of the routes on our application inside of program.cs. However, we can do what's called attribute routing instead. So if I go to my product, attribute routing is where you, just like on our models, we put these little brackets here. These are called attributes that go inside here. And the language is you decorate your methods with attributes. And so that's the language. So what we'll do is we'll go to our product controller. Now that we made this overly complex method, let's bring this back. Comment that out for now. Public iAction result list. Just to demonstrate this. So right now, to hit this route, assuming we'll just go back to kind of what we used as the default, we were to say /product/list, okay? And if we were to throw in a category of shoes, so we're just kind of going back to defaults here. And again, could this be shortened? And the answer is yeah, we could shorten this up using the route attribute. And just for this route, we want to change this to products with the optional ID. And I'll make it lowercase, right? So instead of going /product/list, we'll just at our root do products. And so again, this is just really nice because it can shorten our, if I do /products, notice where it hits us. And then the optional ID of products shoes, then we can get list action category shoes, right? So pretty simple to do, decorate your methods with the route attribute. Again, that's called attribute routing. And you could do that on individual methods like I just demonstrated. You could also, if you have a method, public, void, do something. If you have a method here that you actually don't want to be accessible in a route, like this method is just for, code reusability. If you have another method, you can use attributes saying this is a non-action. And so now this method would not be accessible via a route, so that an end user couldn't call this method, somehow intentionally or otherwise. Okay, so that's another route attribute. We could say this one could be available at route. Well, how could we make this one? We could just say detail /Curly's ID. Excuse me, we'll say product. Right, so instead of /product/detail/ what have you, we can now make this accessible at /product/2. Right, and that hits our detail action. Again, just shortening the URL, which is very nice, right? Shorter URLs, you want them short, you want them readable, short but descriptive. So that's that. And then if you want to, instead of going on individual methods, you could decorate the entire product controller and change the whole route for the entire controller. So you could now notice I'm putting this on the class, the product. I should call that product controller, but nonetheless. Now, in this particular example, we're adding a static retail in front of, for whatever reason, if it makes it more readable to end users. Also the brackets. It's brackets here instead of curlies, which is interesting. So now, in order to get to any one of these methods, we have to add a prefix of retail. So let's see how this works. So now we're going /retail /product/list, and there you go. So we're adding a static, retail in front of it is another way of changing routing, and that changes it for all of the routes, right? Of course, /product/detail, hit that, /4. Okay, so getting the hang of this takes a little bit of practice, definitely. So that takes us on our slide deck pretty far through this lecture, all the way up to this slide right here, which is literally worth reading verbatim. I would, you guys can read it along with me, which come to best practices for URLs. So, as I've said many times, keeping them short while still being descriptive and user-friendly. You could definitely shorten them up so much that it doesn't make sense to an end user. Use keywords to describe the content of a page, not implementation details. And so here I think of those slugs that we were creating, putting those slugs up in the URL that describes the page content, right? What content is on the page? Well, the movie title, the user's name, again, easy for humans to understand and type. I think of whatever.com/products, The idea here is that you should be able to, maybe call someone and say, hey, go to whatever.com/products and land at your endpoint, right? It should be easy to type. Use hyphens to separate words, not other characters. You guys should know this by now, that spaces are not friendly in programming languages, right? So don't separate, and hyphens are slightly better than underscores because I believe they're just considered more readable. And so when I think about this, you guys might remember Pascal casing, for like your classes. And then there's camel casing. And then there's a fun one here called kebab casing, where you're separating each word with a hyphen. So every new word is hyphenated. New word, right? And so Pascal and camel casing, and then there's kebab casing, which is pretty cool. I like the name at least. Prefer names as identifiers over numbers. So I'm thinking /product/ Nalgene water bottle is a better URL than /product/125, right? People probably don't understand what product 125 is, but if you use text as far as what the thing is, then they do. Create an intuitive hierarchy, be consistent, avoid the use of query string parameters if possible. What happens when users hit query strings? And I know you guys have all been there. You hit a query string, you see a question mark, and you start seeing like ampersands, you start seeing all these special characters, and you like throw your hands up, and they get confused by query strings. So end users generally get confused by query strings, where if you put your data in segments, and use these best practices, your URLs will be much more readable and user-friendly, right? So here, product 1307 is not as good as Fender Special Edition Stratocaster. And so, you know, as you kind of go, like this would not, you know, it kind of goes from the least preferable to the most preferable, right? Because this is kind of long, right? If you're looking at that slug, it's kind of long, and you could probably shorten it up a little bit. So it kind of goes from least preferable to most preferable in terms of best practices on your URLs. Okay, and again, using query strings, when end users start hitting this kind of stuff, it would be better to put that implement or the details in your segments as opposed to in these query strings. Okay, with all these routing practices that we've talked about, you should be able to do all of this. Okay, one more concept that is new to this chapter, and it's not heavy on the routing, but you do have to do some routing in order to implement this, is creating parts of your site that are blocked off by permissions. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create an area of our website. So our root website's called our guitar shop. And notice the first subfolder is called areas. Everyone kind of zone back in for me if you guys are kind of zoning out, because this is a lot of talk about routing, and there's a lot to it. Okay, there's a lot to routing, but this is a different concept, and this is something we will do in this class. So I kind of want you to zone in on this concept. So if what we're looking at here is a folder structure, notice what's highlighted. These are all new folders and files in those folders. So you're going to notice that we have just a folder called areas that's in the root. And the idea here is what we're going to have in these areas are going to be locked down with permissions. So the way to lock these things down with permissions, of course, we need user accounts. But you start by putting all of the files inside of controllers and inside of views inside of an admin area. You see how that's laid out there, right? So in order to, for example, add or update a product, you have to be an administrator to add or update a product. Okay, whereas if I go down, you might be able to view your products if you're a standard user. So everything that's highlighted here is going to be locked down by permissions inside of this area called admin. Okay, and so this is going to be a multi-pronged, multi-stages in order to set this up. But kind of the first stage here is to, inside of Solution Explorer, literally just create the folder, add a folder. Let's see. Let me pin this. Right click, add a folder. And this is called areas, and I'm going to capital A. And then inside of that, we're going to create an admin area. Of course, there can be other areas, but this admin area is clearly for admins. So another folder called admin. And inside of that, we have controllers and views. Add a folder called controllers. Add a folder called views. Inside of there, we can start adding inside of our controllers, and of course inside of our views, we can have a shared, just like and inside of there, we might create our layout and our view imports and our view start. So we start adding files to these different areas. How does this apply? Well, right now we're not getting super deep into this. This is kind of phase one. And in order to set us up so that we can route to this area, we need to go back to our program CS and remember the method to map area controller route. And so the order does matter here. I'm going to put it right here. I might need to move map area controller route. Name of admin, area name of admin, and if I say the pattern is admin / controller, all of that looks good. And take that off. So creating the folder structure, putting the files in the right place, so that as we go through this book, again, this isn't all going to be implemented in this chapter. It's introduced in this chapter because, well, we introduce routing. And if we're going to route to these different controllers in these different views, we have to have that pattern set up for us. Okay, and again, if you kind of look here at page 225 or even on the PowerPoint, you can see they can have their own layout. Like administrators can have their own looking, views. Obviously, the layout, the imports, the view start, all of this stuff can be customized for your administrators and kind of what their experience looks like on the front end. Well, no, I wouldn't cut and paste because notice they still exist in both places, right? Notice that there's a controllers under admin, but there's still a controllers in the root of the application. I didn't delete. Let me go back to my code. Notice I still have controllers right here and views and models. I didn't delete anything in there. No, because again, what you'll be able to do here is I'll just take the functionality out of the product controller to, for example, update, and I'll put that update functionality inside of my area so that you have to be an admin to update a product, right? But my list, a standard user can list, but only an admin can update, or only an admin, can add. Does that make sense? So you're just taking the functionality and you're putting them in different places. And I realize it's like, well, we have to flush this example out. We're not done with this, but this is just a start. Okay. With that's kind of the end of the PowerPoint. As far as, I guess there's a little bit more here. On our controllers, notice the home controller has to be decorated with an area of admin. I'm glad I glanced at this, right? So that's also required. So here, area of admin, and notice there, this will say route admin controller ID. And I am noticing one thing here that I don't want to gloss over. Remember, what's in here is considered dynamic, these curlies, but notice there's also brackets. And I'm catching that. let me hold on, hang tight. I want to see what the difference is there. Okay, all this means is instead of, okay, so what the brackets mean is that it will essentially substitute the name of your area, which is admin, inside of here. So instead of hard coding the word admin, it just picks up on, well, this part of the segment will resolve to admin. When you see the bracket here, well, what controller is this? This is the product controller. So this would resolve to admin / product, right? So the brackets mean that the name will be automatically resolved for you instead of typing admin / product. That's what that means, James.
Originally there was an S after the brackets for controller.
Yeah, let me bring that back. Well, sure. What would that do? That would make it the products.
Right. I was just making sure that was what the goal was and not just a typo.
Yeah, that's the goal. Okay. So you can now see if you go to /admin / products, kind of the different routes that you'll hit based on that. Okay. So that's your areas. And now we do a little bit of practice. In the back of the chapter, if you guys want to do this little exercise, this is just practice with routing. So I'm going to do this exercise with you guys. Exercise 6.1, page 229. So I'm going to close this and save my example. So in the student download for the book, EX starts, chapter 6, routing practice, double click the solution file.
Post the zip file of just that folder. I don't know if anyone
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm just following these steps in the book. You can follow along, but I've done it before, so I might be a little bit faster, but let's open the home controller class. Bless you, home controller. We're just looking at the defaults here. If you were to hit this, it would return home. If you were to hit this, it would return privacy. Right, so it says go ahead and boot this up. And as Connor said, this was built a while ago, so it might be a different version of what we have installed, but mine did seem to boot up. Did your guys' boot up? Yeah? Okay. So if I go to /home privacy, we get that. Home index, we get that. If we go to /display, we get no ID supplied. 123 ABC, we get ID 123 ABC. All right, so that takes us all the way up through step number 7. So now we're on step number 8, and that's just testing what's built in, what's provided. So now we make our own action method, public action result. Countdown. Int ID equals 0. So we just loop through some number of times and count down. So bring in a for loop. We start our counter at the ID that's supplied while I is greater than or equal to 0. we decrement. And we put I inside of our string plus a line break. And return content that is our string. So we're just building a string through a loop, and it's going to go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And if we just go there without supplying, if we go to home count down, it says counting down 10. Yeah, it says, what did I, let's see, I should say countdown 0, right? Yeah. Let me double check my I is 0, 0 greater than 0. Okay. I have a logic error here. Let's debug.
ID set to 0.
Right. So the default should be 0. That's right. Okay, build succeeded. Home controller, countdown method, slash home display. I broke something, hang tight. Okay, it's been a long day of coding. I just retyped it as I literally just got done telling you the benefits of retyping your code. And okay, it's working now as intended. So if I hit slash home slash countdown, it assumes the ID of 0. It says counting down, this appends a 0, and then it returns exactly what I would expect. And if I do a slash 5, now we get 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Wahoo, we are now counting down. We can now customize this route with attribute routing to shorten the URL. So I'm going to add a route attribute. We're on 11. And remember the brackets here are where the action will get resolved to countdown. Right? So when you have these brackets, this will be resolved to the associated action, which is countdown. And then this is dynamic, dynamic ID, and it's optional. Okay, so now instead of having to go slash home slash countdown, we should be able to just count down. And count down from 10, and we count down. So yay, we shorten the URL with attribute routing. we can add more segments, and so we can make this a little bit more, change the functionality on this. So we can set up a start and end and a message, which the end and the message are optional. And therefore, our identifiers have to be start, a default provided for the optional, let me get that all on one screen. We are now going to start I at start. We're going to end it at end. Right, so I change my loop to start at start, to end at end, and then I will put the message onto my string after my loop. And to test it, we go /countdown. And the required is, I don't know, 5. And then the end is assumed, but let's just say start at 5, end at 2, and say boom. 5, 4, 3, 2, boom. And say, hey, you guys, I have no idea what boom shakalaka. What movie is that from? Any idea? Heard this quote before? Boom shakalaka? It's a 90s thing, you guys.
Zoolander.
Let's Google boom shakalaka. No idea. Okay, moving on. Okay, and that is the end of the student practices. So not a whole ton in there, but a little practice. Yep.
In order to have the message go, you need an end.
Yeah.
Okay.
The way we have it coded. To have the message, you must have an end. Otherwise, you just have a start. Yes, sir. You sure can. All right, that is the end on the lecture on routing.